We're finally going to be reviewing Max Miller again. Our last video did very good and everybody loved it, so today we're going to be seeing another video on how he makes a steak. Well, not really a steak, it's a fake steak, but you'll see what I mean. Now, let's get started.
So this is going to be the first in a series of videos that I release over the next few months about the home front during World War II for various countries, and not just the Allied powers like the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, but also the Axis powers like Japan and Germany. But since I am from the US, I figured I would start at home and have the first video be from America's point of view, even though we were kind of Johnny-come-latelys when it came to World War II. We didn't even enter the war until a few years after it started, and even then we didn't start rationing food until mid-1942.
I'm a bit of a history buff, so I'm going to enjoy this video. We were also quite late to the war in World War I as well. In America, we have the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean separating us from the continents, so we're on the other side.
It was in May of 1942 that the first ration card was distributed to all Americans, and this was focused on rationing sugar. This was followed by coffee rationing later that year, which led people to brew Roosevelt coffee, which was just weak coffee made from reused grounds.
Kind of sounds like what we used to do during the 2008 crisis. We used to save our tea bags and reuse them.
And then came the rationing of meat, dairy, cooking oils, and a whole host of canned and processed foods. And as ingredients became more and more difficult to find, publishers put out recipes designed to make rationing more bearable. And one of the most iconic of these books was Betty Crocker's Your Share: How to Prepare Appetizing, Healthful Meals with Foods Available Today.
You know what I'm sitting here thinking? I'm wondering if Jack's actually made some of these recipes, because some of the inventions that we've seen, no, eh?
That's great. This did a great job. That's a lot of juice.
If you haven't seen his enchilada video, go see that video, but I warn you, don't eat before seeing it, okay?
The book, published in 1943, starts off with a section on stretching meat and cautions consumers to watch your P's and Q's. The cookbook gives an example of 1 pound of ground meat, which serves 4 or 5 people and costs 7 points, while the same weight of a porterhouse steak, which could only serve 2 or 3 people, would cost 12 points.
Oh my goodness, what a headache of a system. Good thing that we don't have that system today. Well, hopefully we won't get it again.
So if you're running low on points, but you have a hankering for a steak, you're kind of out of luck unless you follow Betty Crocker's recipe for emergency steak.
The reason why ground meat was cheaper, and it still is today, instead of like a sirloin or anything like this, is because ground meat, whether you like to hear it or not, is normally all the trimmings and all the other offcuts that you can't really use for steak or any nice cuts. So this is why sometimes when you get your ground meat, you may find bones in it, you may find tendons and ligaments that are not finely chopped up. I mean, I've almost cracked a tooth a few times because of the ground meat having bones in it. That's just how it is.
It calls for 1 pound of ground beef or hamburger, a half cup of milk, 1 cup Wheaties, 1 teaspoon salt, 1/2 teaspoon pepper, 1 tablespoon chopped onion. Place on pan, pat into T-bone steak shape 1 inch thick, broil 8 to 15 minutes at 500 degrees, very hot. Turn once.
This is a meatloaf, but instead of using like eggs or maybe even bread, a panade, to act as a binder, we're using Wheaties. Okay, you can use Wheaties, yeah, it's not a problem. It's gonna change the flavor.
Now, I have yet to try this emergency steak, and I kind of think that it's not going to actually taste like a real steak, but at least it only costs 7 ration points instead of 12, which a regular steak would cost.
You know the funny thing, I had a burger just last night. Now I'm watching on how to make a meatloaf.
As we've covered in a previous episode, Betty Crocker was basically just a character that was created to sell the products of General Mills, or originally the Washburn-Crosby Company.
The thing is, during that time, General Mills was much more important than it is today. You've kind of seen a lot of these brands that have been very famous back in the day. Today, they're not as famous anymore.
The thing is, since Wheaties are a flaked cereal, I'm thinking that just sticking them into this meat combo, it will lead to a very jagged steak. So I'm assuming that they are being used as a binder of some sort, so I'm going to go ahead and crush them up. Not super fine, but fairly fine.
Max has the right idea here. He needs to crush the cereal up. However, instead of using your hands, you should really just pop it into a little blender, give it a couple blitz, and then make it into more of a powder. Now in the old kitchen, a panade is basically stale bread that you do the exact same thing. You rip it up and you allow that to soak up milk. Once you mash it into a little bit of a paste, you add this to the meatloaf and then you mix it in. This helps create not only a binder, but it helps to keep the the ground meat moist. You can, however, add too much.
Then I don't think it really matters the order that you mix the ingredients, but the way that I did it was I took the pepper and salt and added it to the meat, and then I added the chopped onion and mixed all of that in, and then added the Wheaties. Once everything was combined, I added the milk, and it took a minute or so of mixing, but eventually everything came together. And then once everything is together, you come to the hard part, and that is sculpting this meat into the shape of a T-bone steak.
When you start cooking, you will realize that you get to play with your food a lot. What I would recommend is if you have to shape anything like this in the kitchen, instead of what you see a lot of YouTube chefs do, like Jack,
Beautiful.
take your rings off before you do this, and the best thing is to put on some gloves. That way you keep your hands clean and you also don't do any like cross-contamination.
So put the meat onto a baking sheet lined with foil. You don't have to use aluminum foil. They wouldn't have used foil at that time because aluminum was scarce and there's a war on, don't you know? But I'm using foil because it's going to make it a lot easier later on.
If you don't want to use foil, you can use parchment paper, or you can also butter or spray the pan if you don't want a big mess. But if you do use foil, it'll help you if you don't want to be cleaning it up.
Then start to mold the meat into the shape of a T-bone steak.
Ooh.
I think I got pretty close, though I kind of wish I had like a real T-bone steak nearby to use as a model.
Max, you did actually really good. You did excellent, actually.
What is most important is that you don't make it much thicker than 1 inch. He says 1 inch, because if it is much thicker, then the ground meat on the inside is not going to cook all the way, and that would be bad.
Well, you could make it thicker, it just means it's going to cook longer. I mean, it's the same thing with cooking meatloaf or anything. If you put it into a block, it's going to take about an hour. But with all ground meat, you want to cook it to the point of where it reaches about 160, 165 Fahrenheit, because you want to make sure that you kill the bacteria. A steak is not the same thing. This is why you can cook a steak to like medium rare, because most of the bacteria, the microbes, are on the meat surface. The moment that you start mashing it up or you start cutting into it, this is the moment when, like with ground meat, you need to cook it fully through because all that bacteria has been mixed in with everything.
But once your T-bone steak is ready, set it in the oven under the broiler at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 Celsius, and let it broil for about 8 minutes.
I think somebody cleaned their oven before the video. His oven looks immaculate. Like, look at that. It is so shiny, you could actually see your reflection off of it.
Then remove it from the oven and flip it. The issue here is this is not a real steak, so if you try to flip it like with a flipper of some sort or tongs, it will disintegrate. So the best way that I found to do it was to take another pan that was clean with foil, set it on top, and then flip both of them together, wearing gloves. Flip both of them together, and then you flipped your steak.
Now this is a very good little trick. Sometimes in the kitchen, when you need to do something like this, you have to use what you have on hand. Now if you don't have one of those big longer spatulas that you normally see in the kitchen with people like flipping burgers or anything, then flipping it like this would be a good idea.
Then put that steak back under the broiler for another 8 minutes or so, or until the internal temperature reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Golly, the oven is clean. My oven's not that clean.
On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The US was now officially part of a conflict that had been raging in Europe for over 2 years and in Asia for over 4. And almost immediately, the Office of Price Administration, which had been established only months before the attack, set in to rationing certain items to the American public.
If any of you guys ever do get the chance to go over to Hawaii, specifically Oahu, which is the capital of the islands, you will see the USS Arizona, my home state, you know, the battleship. But you can go to the memorial, and I went to the memorial when I was 14, I think it was. At least when I went, the oil from the battleship was still leaking into the harbor.
Just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sale of tires was cut off. At that time, 75% of all the rubber in the US was used to make car tires. But as a single battleship required over 75 tons of rubber, this meant tires on the home front were a luxury the US could no longer afford. You were actually encouraged/ordered to save your 5 best tires and sell others to Uncle Sam.
Imagine if you had a flat tire or more than one flat tire. You'd be screwed, wouldn't you? This is when having a horse would have been a better option, I think. We take so much for granted today, it's unreal. It really is.
Should you really need a tire, you could get one, but you had to apply and go through a long process just to be able to possibly purchase one. So it was all about conserving the tires that you did have. And this led to something known as the victory speed or war speed, which was basically a national speed limit of 35 miles an hour, which reduced wear and tear on the tire.
35 miles an hour as a national speed limit. If anyone has been over to Germany, France, or even Spain, and you've seen how high the speed limits are over here, it's around 120, 130 kilometers an hour. But in the US, I mean, the national speed limit depends on what you're driving, like on the I-5 or the 401. It's still not that fast. And it takes forever in the US to get from point A to point B sometimes, especially if you have to drive across country. If anyone hasn't been to the US, if you drive from the East Coast to the West Coast, it's going to take you a good amount of time. It really will.
Shortly after the tires became rationed, so too did bicycles and automobiles altogether. Any company that had been making these items instead turned to making military vehicles and munitions. Gasoline too was being rationed, and people were encouraged to join car-sharing clubs, basically carpools. One government poster from the time encouraged you to join one because when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And these weren't really optional restrictions. Today, if you are caught speeding, you'll get a ticket. But then, if you're caught speeding, you could have your gasoline ration taken away entirely, so you can't drive at all.
My goodness, I hope things don't get back to that point, honestly. But this is just the thing. It's like if you live in a place where you don't really need to use a vehicle, it's not very important. But if you live in a place where you live in the sticks, and you need some sort of transportation, then it's important.
What's interesting is that the gasoline and other fuels like coal, while very important for the war effort, were not as precious as some other items because America produced plenty of oil and coal, so they could always just make more. But there were other commodities that were not produced at home, and so they were severely rationed. Things like rubber. Most of the rubber at the time came from Southeast Asia, and as soon as the war set in, the Japanese cut off that supply completely. Another ingredient that was like that was sugar, and that's why it was the first to be rationed, because most of the sugar that the US was eating came from the Philippines.
You know, I think this was what led to the invention of high fructose corn syrup, which was actually made in like the 1950s, believe it or not. But the big issue is that when you enter a US store and you pick up almost any ingredient, when you look at the ingredients, sugar or a substitute of sugar will be listed in there. And it's not always needed. You don't need to add sugar to everything.
There were other reasons, like the supply chain. It was very taxed at the time, and things like trucks and railroads were completely overrun transporting troops and war supplies from coast to coast. In addition, those troops being transported were usually young men who had been taken out of the workforce, so there was a huge labor shortage. And very quickly, many women stepped in to take those jobs, but it wasn't immediate, and it was kind of a game of catch-up for quite some time.
It was the same in the UK. My grandmother, my English grandmother, was actually building Lancasters for Vickers. And keep in mind, she was the type of sweet grandma that every time you would see her, she would always have a pastry made. She would have cake, she would have scones, she would have something for you to eat.
There was the issue of feeding those troops who were no longer producing food, because not only were they taking up food, but they also took up a lot of other items that were required to get the food to them in places like Europe, Africa, and Asia. Like a lot of their food was packaged in tin cans, but the US had almost no tin. And so foods like processed foods and canned goods became extremely scarce almost overnight. Stores put up signs letting people know how their stock had decreased over the year, and processed foods were often down around 80%. So to stop people from buying up all the canned goods and hoarding them, they too became rationed.
Oh, I hope it doesn't go that way again. I mean, I'm sure it's worse in some places, but just locally here, I have seen the food prices almost double. Guys, let me know down below how much like a whole chicken costs you, because here, it used to cost only €5 for a whole chicken. That was a good price.
Rationing something like sugar is very easy. You get 4.5 ounces per week. Simple as that. But rationing something like canned food is a little bit more difficult. First of all, it's all different sizes, and does a can of tomato soup equal the same as a can of green beans? What if you don't like tomato soup? It just became much more complicated. Luckily, Britain, who had been rationing for several years at this point, already had a system that the US could look at as a model, and that was the points system. Every person in the US, regardless of age, received an allotment of red and blue points. Red were used for meat, dairy, and fats, and blue were used for canned and bottled goods as well as baby food.
I'm wondering if Max is going to talk about the victory gardens, because this was also a very important thing during the war, victory gardens. I'll speak more about that later if he doesn't.
Each week you had a certain amount of points that you could use, and you had to use those in conjunction with money to actually buy the product itself, so they also started putting price caps on pretty much every item in the country. The system was clunky and complex and confusing for many people, so the government started putting out these newsreels to kind of try to explain it, and one of my favorites has a narrator who sounds like a cartoon gangster from the 1940s, and it's funny because he even kind of admits that it's a terribly confusing system, and he says that in comparison, this makes filling out income taxes strictly for amateurs. And there were lots of people who now wish they hadn't played hooky when the teacher was giving out with addition and subtraction.
At that time, Britain was still using the old money system in the UK, so it's not the easy system that we had in the US, where we have nickels, dimes, and quarters. But in the UK, no, a farthing was a quarter of a penny. So do the math with that, okay? And keep in mind, people didn't need to use calculators at the time. I mean, you would have to do the math in your head.
Most people realized there is a war on, and I gotta do my part. And so they accepted rationing, even though they were always kind of grumbling about it. But in 1943, the government tried to explain how important it was, saying rationing is essentially democratic. It protects the little man who is unable to pay exorbitant prices for articles of which limited quantities exist. Basically, rationing was the only way to make it fair for everyone and to keep down what could be rampant inflation.
I don't know about all of you, but I'm seeing some similarities here with food and inflation. I mean, olive oil, and I talked about this even a few years ago. I was explaining how olive oil here used to be at like €1.20 for a litre of extra virgin olive oil. Well, maybe not extra virgin, but olive oil. And then it went up to around €5 or €6 per litre in less than a year. It's just astronomical.
There were ways, though, to kind of get around some of the rationing rules, and that was simply to eat more foods that didn't require ration points, because not everything required points. Pretty much all fresh vegetables and fruits were never rationed. A fresh zucchini to Germany, it's just not gonna last. So fresh vegetables, have as many as you want. And that kind of went for most fresh foods.
It's a good thing that Uncle Roger didn't grow up during this time. This would have been his worst nightmare.
Eat spinach. Hiya. Vegetable tastes like sad anyway. Don't eat vegetable.
Fresh milk was never rationed, though processed milk products like cheese or evaporated milk or butter, those were rationed. Though if you did ever want your cheese fix, you could eat Kraft macaroni and cheese because you could get 2 boxes for only 1 ration point.
My goodness, you know, the more that Max is explaining all these things, the more it makes sense why all these companies that make all the processed foods and everything became so popular after the war. You know how long it's been since the last time I actually had Kraft macaroni? I think I was 12.
One of the few fresh foods that was rationed was meat, especially beef, which was one of the most costly items, both in money and in points. Like the one that we're making today, the emergency steak, is using lesser quality meats to mimic a better cut of meat. And then there were recipes that just tried to kind of replace meat altogether. Like one for baked peanuts, a meat alternative, which included peanuts, tomatoes, and molasses that was baked in a dish.
Baked peanuts? But was this also the case for like chicken and every other type of meat? I mean, I understand that beef was hard to get because in America, even still, beef is still a very common meat.
It wasn't so much to mimic the taste or texture of meat. Nobody was pretending that it was, but it was meant to mimic the nutritional value that you would get if you were to eat a sirloin. But even those foods that were not rationed could still be very difficult to get. Like for the entirety of the war, eggs were incredibly hard to find. So you have a lot of recipes from this period for eggless cakes. Because of all these reasons, people started raising and growing their own food at home. People would raise chickens and rabbits, especially in the city, and if you had a little bit more space, a lot of people would have goats or pigs or even cattle.
My goodness, imagine that when you're in downtown New York, yeah? Waking up to the sound of a rooster doing cock-a-doodle-doo at 5 a.m. When you move out to the country, expect that you're going to be hearing some animals like this, because even when I first moved here, I have a neighbor that has some chickens, and at 5 in the morning, sure enough, before the sun would even come up, the chicken would do his little call in the morning.
And then there was the Victory Garden. Now again, this is something that the US was able to look across the pond to Britain because the British had been building Victory Gardens for a while, though actually both in the US and in Britain they had done this back in World War I. But World War II really saw the Victory Garden come to life. And by May 1943, there were 12 million Victory Gardens growing in America's cities and another 6 million on unused farmland.
Well, I can attest to this. This is something that my English family also did. Everybody in the family, and even though that my dad, he grew up quite poor, they lived in government housing, my grandparents still had enough money to buy a little plot of land, not next to the house, they had to drive to it, to be able to grow more food. And even to the day that my grandma died, she would still be in the garden, planting and growing like beans, peas, whatever she could grow in the garden.
Cities converted parks to be community-run Victory Gardens, like the lawns of Riverside Park in New York City, the Boston Common, and portions of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. They would put out books like the ABC of Victory Gardens to teach us city dwellers how best to turn your backyard into an instrument of war.
Well, you would think, though, that in the US, we obviously have more open spaces. It's easier to have more land, have more space, have more of everything. So I guess that during that time, it was a little easier for people living out in the country to be able to do this.
What I found interesting is that there wouldn't have actually been such a need for these Victory Gardens had the government not kind of shot themselves in the foot right from the get-go. See, the vast majority of certain fruits and vegetables were being grown in California, Oregon, and Washington state, and many of the farms were owned by Japanese Americans. For instance, a full half of the tomatoes and 95% of snap peas were grown just by Japanese American farms.
Now, this is something I never learned. That is absolutely amazing. But you would have thought that somebody would have thought about this, no, during the time?
And so when FDR signed Executive Order 9066 and sent many of those same growers to inland internment camps, over 6,100 farms were taken, but many lay fallow due to a lack of labor. But since those who had been sent to those camps knew so much about farming, the Victory Gardens that they set up at these Japanese internment camps turned out to be some of the most productive in the entire country.
My goodness, that's impressive. The thing is, though, on my mom's side of the family, my great-grandparents were all farmers. So they all came from Indiana. Well, at least that side of the family did. But it really does pay to have foresight, doesn't it? Kind of like Jamie Oliver making his egg fried rice with chili jam.
Never heard of chili jam? Is this how you trick white people to eating chili? You give them fresh chili, they go,
No, I don't actually like chili.
give them chili jam, and they go,
Oh.
Now, while most Americans were growing their own fruits and vegetables, raising livestock, and accepting the nature of rationing with as much dignity as they could muster, there were, of course, some who thought that they were above the rules and didn't play fair, and this led to a thriving black market. This usually took the form of a consumer overpaying the monetary value of a certain product and not giving the grocer or whoever it was any ration stamps. You know, a little under the table. I'll pay you double, but no stamps.
Yeah, the black market, of course. This is going to be something that you're always going to have. I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it? If anyone likes history, even when you read about Prohibition in the US, this was an attempt to outlaw alcohol across the entire country. Well, that didn't turn out too well. There was a big underground network of smuggling alcohol, creating it, selling it, and then you had speakeasies, which were like secret bars.
Now, there was, of course, a social stigma against this. You know, why should I have to play by the rules if you're not? But since everyone kind of hated rationing, it wasn't that uncommon. They say that a full 17% of the meat that was being sold in the US at the time was being sold via the black market. And these people who were doing this were not called bootleggers like they were during Prohibition, but meatleggers.
You know, I honestly don't think I've heard that term before. Bootlegger's common. Was there another one for other things like sugar or honey or any of the other commodities?
And here we are. Emergency steak from the World War II home front.
Whoa.
I mean, it kind of looks like a steak. Kind of, if you don't look too closely, you squint.
I'll be honest, he did a really good job, especially for the shape. I'm pretty sure it's going to taste like a meatloaf. I mean, come on, it's ground meat. He added basic ingredients for a meatloaf, well, except for the little cornflakes.
It's pretty cool, actually. And it smells good. Smells like meatloaf. Pretty sure it's going to taste like meatloaf because looking back, it's kind of a lot like meatloaf. Here we go. That is pleasantly delightful. It does kind of taste like meatloaf, but a little bit different. I was thinking that it wasn't going to have a lot of flavor because there isn't a lot of spice or anything in there, but it actually has a really good amount of flavor. Maybe the Wheaties really add something.
I have a feeling it is the Wheaties. I mean, look at the ingredients of the Wheaties. Depending on which ones you get, you may have a lot of sugar in them.
I mean, I think you could put like a sauce with it, but I don't think you really need it. It's really good as is. Emergency steak. Very nice.
You know what I'm thinking right now? We have to see if Jack's made something like this. I mean, he's made the poor man's this, the poor man's that. He's made other inventions that I don't even want to mention.
Whoa, that shot right back at me. And that gets mixed in. All right, now if you mix it properly, it's gonna look just like this.
He made his own pulled pork, which, if you haven't seen that video, go check that one out too, huh?
Now, the rationing of meat pretty much ended with the end of the war, I think shortly thereafter, and most of the rationing ended at the end of the war or shortly thereafter. But there was one ingredient that was rationed all the way until 1947.
Sugar,
and it was
no?
the ingredient that had
I
been
bet it
the
was
very
sugar.
first to be rationed, and that is sugar. So pretty crazy that it was still being rationed 2 years after the end of the war. But that is nothing in comparison with what Great Britain had to go through. They were still rationing certain ingredients, meat being one of them, until 1954, 9 years after the end of the war.
And keep in mind that Great Britain at the time, the UK, England, was not just Great Britain, it was still the British Empire. Well, it was heavily weakened after 2 world wars, but still, it wasn't just a little island.
But I will touch on England or Great Britain and how they dealt with the home front and rationing and living on the home front because they were actually part of the war. Battle of Britain, all that rot.
Yeah, you could say that they were a part of it. Yeah, definitely.
But make sure to keep watching and it'll pop up one of these days. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. We learned a lot today, we really did, and I'm happy that we saw this video. If you did have any questions or comments, let us know down below. I'll try to answer them. And I'll see you guys again very soon. Until then, take care.